Hey everybody. It's funny how I often begin making a video and I'm honestly just out really trying to get some exercise, be out of the box. But before making a video, I often have at least a pro forma agenda. I have some things I want to talk about. And I'm experiencing a conflict because beginning something important, sensitivity to what's actually going on might be the most important thing. And so if I begin with an agenda and I follow it, I might miss another opportunity near at hand. I might even discover unexpectedly that the agenda was a ladder, right? That it wasn't good enough. It was supposed to get me near a terrain in a fuzzy way that I could then traverse intelligently with awareness and sensitivity. But if I just follow the ladder, if I don't get off the ladder at the top of my agenda, meaning if I don't get off the ladder once it's carried me to the landscape and enter the landscape heartfully, reverently, humbly, then I'm likely to become pretty pointy. Yeah. I'm going to have some point that I want to deliver, and I'm not going to be in the moment. I'm not going to be with the essence of what I truly hope to find or become able to say. And right now, as I'm speaking, I'm on the balancing beam between what's going on right here, right now, and my agenda. Many of us don't have the luxury that I am currently enjoying, and that number drops to nearly none once we start moving our mouths. And usually, before our mouths begin to move, our minds are complexly anatomizing, right? Turning into little organs and connecting and bringing what we will say into potential. And it seems that a relatively small number of us, if us is everyone, all the humans, have the luxury of even ever becoming aware of what I'm speaking with you about now. They don't ever escape the gravity of the constant cycling of thought. And once they begin speaking, particularly if they're speaking about something important or deeply felt, an ironic thing occurs, which is the boat begins to ride the pilot. Rather than carrying the pilot to new opportunity and awareness and insight, something resembling understanding, creativity, the pilot becomes the slave of his boat. And had I merely been following my agenda and not trying still to walk on that borderline, to step into the between consciously, reverently, of the before of my thoughts and intentions and agenda and speech, just before that, somewhere to walk, to try, to assay, to attempt. There was a little moment there where I started to tip over into knowledge. And I'm really struggling, in case it isn't obvious. This isn't a balanced walk. It would be far easier to balance if I stopped moving my mouth. And in fact, the moment I do that, my body feels very different. I'm going to attempt the opposite of irony, which means rather than having my agenda double down on itself and dominate me and the conversation, I'm going to attempt to do something really daring. I'm going to attempt to stay in that between, even while I have an agenda, and let both aspects of my consciousness play together. Right? Allow those aspects that are ordinarily silenced by the overarching machinations of the waking mind and the waking world and traffic and noise and responsibility and role. I'm going to be willing to struggle and to lose my balance toward being too didactic and to fall over a little bit into dreaming, and we'll let these two dance some. Because if I didn't, I'd depart myself, in a manner of speaking. And that boat's real heavy when it's directing the pilot from atop her back, his back, their back. And, I think I use that weight ordinarily, right? I feel that burden, I feel that tension, and I use it to energize my orations. Yeah? I get some play out of being ridden by my boat. But something's missing when that's the order of the day. It's like the crust without the pie or something, right? Like, the crust is really structured. And we all probably, those of us who like crust of any kind, right? It's structury, it's crunchy, right? It's flaky, it's got all these ways of interacting with our minds and our mouths and our stomachs. The pie is just really messy. It doesn't, you can cut, it seems like you should be able to cut the crust and then the pie, just the slice just comes out. That's not what happens. And I'm not saying that the pre-verbal senses and embodied living animal of me is all messy. It's not. Though we might remark on how shocking the transition is from the outside of our bodies to the inside. The staggering difference. The crust of our skin hides organs like anciently evolved animals that learned how to cooperate in a union, otherwise unimaginable. I think inside us, you could make a child's drawing of it. There's a family of animals and they're all different. And they keep each other alive together. And I don't think they discriminate much. I doubt they have a lot of biases and prejudices. But I don't doubt something perhaps a bit more shocking, which is that they are beings. There are many beings inside me. And as beings, they have some predecessor to or metalogue of minds. They might even have unique character in a way that we can recognize in animals, most easily those we are familiar with, but turns out that character extends to all of life, every living thing. And contrary to popular opinion and ideation and the peculiar admonitions of our categories and the way we use language, which is a crazy-making way, all of the animals are one thing all the time, first and foremost. Their capacity for individuation derives from communion. That's what makes each one so special in the way we might say in English. And it sounds illogical to say unity equals diversity unless you start thinking carefully about the very questions that are floating on the cesspool of modern popular and political commentary. But I'm going to steer back from that edge for a moment, because over there the terrain is extremely pointy and everybody's being ridden by a boat. And the bigger the boat they picked, the louder you hear them yell. When I say all beings acquire their diversity from unity, I'm not demanding anything religious, or necessarily even properly metaphysical in the senses we ordinarily conceive of this in. No. The actual nature of nature is something we have learned and been trained to see that only the superficial part of, and only the parts that correspond to the categories we were trained to cut things into with the knife of the intellect and describe and name, and those knives, the way they cut, the layers where they make cuts, those knife-like cognitive habits and capacities, they are a very dangerous inheritance. For while claiming to grant us new kinds and degrees of liberty, that potential is extremely difficult to achieve because these knives are dangerous and the humans have forgotten how dangerous they are. And they trust the cuts they make with their knives. Knives they were given by parents and peers and culture and language and idiom and association and connotation, sentence structure, semantics, syntax, all these unique features of the strange disease our people have called language. The humans have long, modern humans, many of them, have long believed that animals don't have minds. If you could imagine an island of men who know there are women, but have never, not one of them have seen them, which would be weird since, between you and me, men come from women. But since we're just being hypothetical, it's an island of men that have never seen women, asking those men about women is essentially, well, it's kind of a big part of ours. But asking those men about women, it would be like asking ordinary people about animals. Of course, they'll admit that their pets have minds. Most of them, that's not too far a stretch. But do they think the sparrows have minds? Do they think the butterflies have minds? Do they think the organs in their bodies have minds? Would they even be capable of considering such a thing? Because if they were to do so, it would change what they thought about every other thing. And the reason is that what has minds is the kind of question that has profound entailments on how you are in the world. If everything has minds, that's a very different world from only those broken monkeys who make bizarre face noises and have manufactured shoes have minds. Broken monkeys. I stole that phrase from a poet, Jeff Conant, in case Jeff, by some bizarre quirk of fate, happens to see this video. But I always loved when he made a little book called Broken Monkeys, and it was a single poem, and it was really good and beautiful. So what I mean is, we might even be wrong with the whole have minds thing. We suppose, for example, that minds are local and produce all their own groceries. Um, it's a complex question, and we don't get to do experiments on humans. Get to? That was weird language. We shouldn't want to do experiments on humans, and yet our culture turns out to be this experimental sort of, this bubbling soup of psychosocial experiments. And so we can't tell whether and what sort of mind-like phenomenon in a human that was never enculturated by other humans would be, though we've encountered a few, wild children and such. We don't know, I think we don't know their stories very well. They're not necessarily reliable examples, but it looks like we transmit something that might be usefully imagined, even if this isn't its entire identity. We transmit something like a disease to our children. And it's the disease of making a mind crust, right? And it takes a while to set in, and that's why children's minds are fluid and dreamy and playful and messy in general, though every child is unique, and some children, are less creative and playful than others. They might be very emotional, right? But most children, no, I'm not going to do that. This is me trying to stay on the balancing beam. Most children evince these qualities because the crust mind hasn't formed yet. And usually what happens to most adult humans as they proceed through the phases of life is that the crust mind crystallizes more and more of their potential to return to something ecstatically beautiful, undifferentiated, pre-verbal awareness. And it's a great tragedy how few of us will have the opportunity to experience this. But we can learn if we so desire, particularly if we're passionate about it. And it doesn't solve the problem of the crust mind for me. You can see I'm still kind of pointy, right? I'm making points and such. I'm coherent. I'm not just singing rhapsodic poetry at you yet. But just to go back to that point for a moment where I talked about humans and thinking about animals and minds. And many humans would believe that animals have minds, but they probably wouldn't like the idea that plants have something, either the precursor or an analog or a metalog. I know for certain that insects have something analogous to personality, so that, I'm sorry, it just implies mind-likeness for me. And one of the things that I was getting at back then, there's a couple that are important to me, I'll try and stay with the good one, is that we don't know what it would be like to be stranded in a field with no other minds. Since we'd already developed one, we would probably continue mind-like behavior for a time. But it's not clear to what degree our minds are local and to what degree distributed. And it's fundamentally important, pun intended, to begin to understand, or at least very deeply question the idea that I possess my mind, or that animals have mind, or things have minds, like a possession. That's the wrong metaphor. And there's so many of these wrong metaphors in our language that we're constantly deceived by them. There are lots of different interesting ways to wonder about minds, but you don't get anything like them in a vacuum of other minds, right? If you deprive the child of language-speaking parents, they will not make face noises like I'm making now. And they may be unlikely to acquire that capacity even if they are later, in their teens or young adulthood, placed with people who speak, apparently. There might be exceptions. There probably are. The problem for all of us, because we all face it uniquely, is how to make the crust work beautifully, prodigiously, with genius and skill and effectiveness and efficiency. And since it's pretty crusty and kind of hardened, right, and it has these flanges, edges and stuff on it, in the way that, I'm imagining it, it's not flexible. So it takes time for insight and learning and dreaming, imagining, exploring to percolate up and actually, change that crust on the surface that we think of as ourselves and that we think of as knowing what's going on, or at least we used to until a few months ago. But everybody's still trying to do that, which I find both touching and somewhat frustrating. And I'm also involved in it because I still have a crust on top, and I, like nearly everyone, have been trained to identify with that crust and think of that as me. And if we look carefully, we'll see that we did not form large portions of that, tectonic plate on the ocean of our mind, right? We did not form large portions of it. Its shape, its purposes, its underpinnings, its urgencies, its fears, its triumphs, all of these were, we outsourced a lot of that, right, to previous generations who built our language and our cultures and things, yeah? And the crust was informed by our immersion in the articulating effluent of television and film and radio and books and people arguing and politics and religion and ethnicity and gender and whatever you want. So all these little articulating forces usually become authoritative in articulating the shape of the crust, and thus what it touches and what it doesn't touch, what it does, what it can't do, so on and so forth. I'd like to turn that crust into something resembling its more essential nature. And the analogy I'd pick there is wings. But not just wings that let us fly in air, wings that let us fly in dimensions they invent by flying there. Because that is the nature of our human potential. And that is what we were born aching to be and do together, with and for each other, for the history and future of life on our world and beyond. These minds we've trained to crawl were made to fly. But they're weighed down with boats. I know my metaphors are getting mixed here, but it's all crusty, and as we get older, it tends to crystallize and stuff, unless we're really lucky or attentive or curious, or surrounded by others who can help us in some way, to some degree, to sort of descale our minds, right? And to learn about the anatomy, to learn models of anatomies of mind that can be helpful not just in our quest for insight, which is one I love, but in our everyday experience and thought and relationships and concerns in our lives, right? That will have value because we will stop suffering and being constantly reblinded, right, by the otherwise painful crust we've acquired from our life experience and our culture and language and history. Which isn't to say I'd like us to make it all go away, though that would be an interesting experiment. And if someone said, would you like me to make all of that go away, and I thought they could, well, I wouldn't sign up. Don't sign up for that. But I'd be really curious. And if they showed me someone who had undergone this process and I liked what I saw, I might try to figure out how to do it myself. And maybe I've been trying for a long time, actually. And so I at least know that there's this balancing beam between the preconscious, right, the mind, and what the mind does, and how that comes out in language or statements or arguments or, assertions or declarations, so on. I know, and I can follow the path back from the crust, right, down into the inner layers a bit. And my ability to do that depends on a lot of things, but I have the ability to do that. And I would suggest it's a fairly common ability. Nearly all of us who have, a volitional relationship with mind, right? To some degree, we can learn to do this. It's not my goal to extol that here or try to convince you. Rather, I'm actually just trying to not fall over into the face noises land too much. We seem, us humans, an unimaginable anomaly if the face of the living world is our comparator. And we can explain this various ways. That's not going to help me. I think we're participating. I think our minds are evidence. And this is more true when we sort of descale them, right? When we can, or if we can just suspend the primacy of the crust. I think our minds are the expression of relationships among maybe either many minds or possibly all minds. And so one can think of the brain however you want, but the mind has the capacity to act as some kind of transceiver. Yeah, it can transmit and it can receive. And our models and our ideas don't generally accord with this fact. However, just the fact that I can speak this language and it reaches you and that you can understand it, right, is proof that minds are transceivers, or at least the analogy's not entirely off, right? So one way to think about some of the understructure of the mind, not all of it, but some of it, right? Because I'm arguing against the idea that we simply possess minds here. One way to think about some of the understructure is that it's shared, right? It's in the between of beings. It's in the between of human beings, in the between of human beings and all of the different beings that live in the natural world. It's in the between of my organs and my brain. It's in the between of the cells in my body and my body. It's in the between of the history of organisms that I am the living moment of expression of, in a way not unlike how the flower of an orchid is a living expression of this plant. And there are many who have argued that minds are kind of this flower thing, and I think there's something to it. I really do. In the sense that there are bees. And pollens are exchanged. Yeah. But what I want to talk about, what I've been thinking of and pondering is just, I've often said that the first brain in our body might be our cells. The second brain might be our gut, because that's way older than brains. There were guts on Earth, and they were the organ of knowing long before there was anything like brains. 6/7 of the history of life on Earth, no brains, just guts. So our gut might be kind of the first brain. Our immune system is another fascinating entity that's mind-like or in the body. And maybe our brain is like the third brain, right? So there's all these sort of layers of brain-like or even meta-brain-ish, right? Even they can be more than, we don't know what all those cells are doing, right? They could be doing something much more sophisticated in their context than what it appears to us, what we are inclined to think about our brains doing in modern times. So there are these layers, right? There's these other layers. There's embodied layers. And some of those layers are way older than brains. Way older. Time at the scale of a single cell must be very different from time at the scale of an animal. And if an hour is equivalent to a week and you have 30 trillion bacterial cells or something like this, then an hour is 30 trillion hours, and our cells go back to the dawn of life on Earth, and they live in a hyperstructure that doesn't really care whether it's on the grass or part of your body, right? They can just, they can ride in every form of life on Earth, in and on, and do. And in fact, without them, we wouldn't be animals. There's this polarity in us, right? There's the animal cells and the bacterial cells and the viruses and, the fungi, apparently. So those cells can be understood to form something like a biorelational hypersystem. They're they can be thought of as like the trans light velocities of organismal sensing and intelligence. I was listening earlier today to an interview with John Carpenter, and he was talking about something very familiar to me, though I hadn't heard his particular take on it. And what he was saying, and I'm going to have to be really careful here, because I'm going to use slightly different language than him. He was saying that psi, meaning what we think of as extrasensory perception, which also has the capacity to see. It has the capacity to see into time in different ways. But there are a lot of different aspects of what we think of as extrasensory perception. And what he was saying is that this is the first sense. That this is the prehensional, like the before thinking sense. And we use it all the time, and it's a natural part of everything, which is something I've been saying for a long time. One of my quips, which is a bit tired, but there isn't anything but psychic phenomenon going on. We just don't recognize that all of this congeals out of that yet. So we have it backwards. We think psychic phenomenon is a super exotic thing that's probably a fairy tale and was made up in old story. No, that's not what's going on. And neither is it true that the kind of light worker, drag wearing psychic people are all actually psychics. Neither of those things are true. But something astonishing is going on, and it's more astonishing than all of our metaphysical ideas. So much more that it would obliterate them if it should shine but the slightest light of its actual activity on our awareness. So he was saying, in his language, psi is the first sense. And he was saying, our bodies respond to things before our minds think about them. This is a well-known fact. Our bodies, our nervous systems, our spidey sense, right? The force. We feel when, and this becomes very apparent if one starts to slow down the games on the crust, right? If you start to get those to settle down, you eventually are going to encounter something that closely resembles what I'm talking about. And you'll become aware that you have forms of awareness that have nothing to do with your consciousness and come way before it. And what consciousness mostly does is package up convenient little explanations and put your little birthday card on there and present those to you as, as if they are definitive, authoritative. It explains things, it describes things long after the fact, right? Long before I've spoken these words, something in me understood that isn't my mind and that isn't these words. It understood the landscape I was seeking, the inner landscape and the ideological landscape, and the essential life pulse from which my desires emerge. So John Carpenter, who's a therapist and a researcher, interesting cat, I like his work. He poses the idea that psi is the first sense, and then there are various layers of like the unconscious mind, the subconscious, the nervous system, the unconscious, the subconscious mind, and then conscious activity is kind of the crown on the head, on the really crusty golden crown on the head of these things. And generally it goes around taking credit for all their work and shutting them down and doing other kingly imperatives. And I'm not trying to be mean, but let's face it, the the minds we're stuck with while we're awake, for many of us anyway, can be really cruel taskmasters. And they, that's bad enough. But if we had the opportunity to just sort of do that descaling movement, right? That analogy that I'm making, to take the crust off and see with unfettered consciousness all of the layers of unimaginable intelligence that are actually precessing within us in a way like the sun goes through the sun, the moon, and the stars come out. All of these intelligences within us are doing this all day long, but we're so involved with our minds that we don't get a taste of it. And then if we do get a taste of it and we're not relatively disciplined, we're likely to start telling stories in regular human language about this is psychic, that's this is supernatural, so on and so forth. I imagine a people who were born with shoes on. We'll just make up a story for fun. And these people are born with shoes on and no one ever takes them off, and actually they've never even seen an unshoed person. And I guess this is not entirely unlike most of us, right? Most of us haven't seen inside bodies. But for these people, a foot would be supernatural. If they saw a foot, they'd be like really freaked out and scared. And it might terrify them. They might start killing each other. They could start religions. It would be a catastrophe in this story, right? In the little, fable that I'm making. And this is what's kind of going on with us. We were born, our minds are made for things we do not know exist. And if we want to point in that direction, for some reason, for a long time, everyone thought it was really spooky, so they called it the supernatural. But it's actually just the natural. And the weirdness of the natural, the staggering complexity of the accessible intelligence and heroic imperatives of the natural would obliterate our entire set of categories. Never mind metaphysical or concrete. That would just be obliterated and gone. Those categories are so crude that if that's what you're trapped with, it's like having your legs tied together and then going out through your life like that, right? And I know because I've been there, and I'm not entirely free of it, even though I'm aware of these matters. I'm still in the prison with y'all. But I can imagine a day when we break out and the distortions we inherited again become wings. Wings that can make new dimensions in which to fly every time they fly together. And this is what the children are seeking. And to be honest, I remember, and I've talked to very small children, they're extremely puzzled about what's wrong with the adults. They get it right away that, oops, something went wonky with daddy in his head sack, right? Oops, mommy's living in a linguistic fantasy that has nothing to do with what's going on. Little children, they get this all the time because their minds are still they're trying to fly, right? They're trying to get those wings going, and the culture and the parents keep chopping them off and leading the children to believe that that's exactly what's supposed to happen, and rewarding them for, the little rituals where amputation occurs. And this has been going on since time immemorial for our species, for reasons that are so bizarre and crazy that I'm not even going to approach them here, presuming that the knowledge that I have is even useful. Nature is fundamentally transcendent. And this is the word that I like. I'm not committed, I'm not married, but I like this word. Nature is transcendent. It's much more than sentience. Than sentience. Sentience is a downstream result of effulgently hyper-intelligent processes in nature. So, sentience is a lower order result of processes, of higher order processes that are constantly in relation with minds and bodies and organisms, yeah? And by higher order, I mean not requisitely, specifically, physically embodied. Intelligences that can exist without being tied to a single body as we know them. They may be the field effects of myriads of minds, but I think the myriads of minds are the dandelion seeds of those intelligences. And I'm not asking you to believe this, right? I'm not trying to convert you or anything. I'm merely putting my own sense and experience making a sketch of it, yeah, in case it is useful. But the way that we ordinarily think, we think of our minds as being very effective and good and powerful and knowledgeable and so on and so forth. In the contexts where we need the kinds of minds we've been given by our ancestors, in commercial culture, these minds work okay, kinda, like a three-wheeled, like a car missing a wheel, in those contexts for most of us, unless we develop them very carefully, or we are gifted, or we're very lucky, or we have great mentors, and few of us, I think relatively few of us have that opportunity. And most of us did bring some implicit gifts, some special, unique abilities and proclivities to our human incarnation. But again, a lot of that gets digested, right, by the culture and sort of turned into various kinds of crusts that don't do the flying thing anymore. We have these really weird problems with language, like we have this word imagination. And by the way, I'm going to go back to Carpenter for a minute. There's a reasonable quantity of research, it seems to me, that demonstrates that our minds are reacting after the fact of phenomenon. Like thoughts are the evidence of invisible work done elsewhere. And done at in a very sophisticated way, at a high rate of speed, but vastly slower than our nervous system. You can't think your way out of evading a suddenly intrusive threat. If you hand that off to thought, you die. Our nervous systems, our bodies, they evolve to respond relatively instantaneously to hints even. And some people will say, well, that's all that you're really talking about is people using hints really well. No, it's not. I'm talking about research where people can predict, not with their minds, with their bodies. You can watch people's metabolism and they can tell when a threat image is going to be, they can tell before, right? A threat image is going to be presented in a random series of images. Their body responds before it has been decided that the image will be shown by a random number processor, which is either seeing into the future or, right? So the body, whether they're not necessarily consciously aware of that, and they don't have to be. These things are taken care of. I don't know whether to call like the really intelligent tiny stuff high level or low level, but we'll call it lower level because we'll think of smaller as lower here. But they're taken care of by processes that aren't entirely automatic. They're not merely, you know, the nervous system. They are relationally sensitive. Yeah, they are relationally sensitive. Essential. So, Carpenter's thesis is that psi is really common and we use it all the time in ways we're completely unaware of consciously. And some people are really good at using it, you know, more directedly for specific results and stuff. And then some people just have the question. I'm not trying to answer the question of is there telepathy or not, but there is. I'm just trying to say, I think we've got the mountain upside down. We've stood the mountain on its point and thought the point was the, you know, the whole mountain. Or maybe it's the iceberg problem. I mean, whatever you like, right? But we've gotten things backwards. We think that one of the clumsiest and slowest and most complicated aspects of what humans do is the powerful, intelligent, good one, when in fact it's more like this weird combination of, well, I have to be careful here. The purposes for which it is well suited exist largely in a representational between context of human beings, right? You need it there. And you need it if you want to make complex devices and things. You need it if you want to have mathematics. So this overlay on consciousness that we call our mind can form specialized crusts, right? Like those of a musician or a poet or an author or a doctor, a surgeon, a mechanic, an engineer, a wanderer. They can form complex topologies of highly developed expression, highly developed representational expression. For those of us who are lucky enough to have the luxury of becoming what we refer to as educated, hopefully a goodly portion of those get a diverse and well-rounded education. An education rich in novelty and intelligence and creativity and insight. But that's relatively uncommon, and some few of us manage to preserve wing-like aspects of our minds throughout the process of enlanguaging and enculturation. And this is one of the reasons why artists are often sort of worshipped, is because they are the emissaries from underneath the crust, right? They're going to show you what's bubbling down there to some degree. Yeah. Musicians and performing artists and all these artists, painters, poets, writers, singers, actors. The really good ones shake up the crust, right? They mess with that crust and sort of cause you to go deeper into yourself and your own feelings and experience. Or they catalyze that process, they invite it. Yeah. It's unfortunate that it's such a privilege. I mean, I feel deeply humbled and honored that I have had the privilege to learn some of these things and to try to see into the essence of, birth and life and death and light and time and living beings and intelligence, language, knowledge. Of course, the crusts are kind of form of knowledge, right? They're little, like those sheaves of fungi that you see growing out from the stump of a dead tree. It's knowledge. It's a way of visualizing knowledge. Although I'm not as anti-crust as I might sound. It's just that I want us to know together. I want us to have our wings back. The many kinds of wings that are natural to our humanity. There's a lot of people out here today. It's sunny. It's hot. I'm gonna cross the street. I feel really privileged. I feel privileged to have lived this long. I feel privileged for every glimpse I've had of anything resembling insight. I feel privileged for the astonishing abundance of living beings all around me, within me, and in you. If you don't think humans are social animals, you can see that in general they like to be together. And that's no accident. But there's a place where we're never not together. There's a dimension of unity from which some aspect of me is emerging in moment to moment into expression in this body, in this life, in my senses. And it's not conceptual, and it has nothing to do with mechanics. And there's not a single model I've ever seen that would survive the briefest glimpse of this thing. It's funny, you know. The humans are fascinated by aliens, but they don't realize that each one of them comes from beyond. Not just in terms of, you know, not just in terms of their origin moment, though certainly in those terms. No, we're coming from beyond right now, right? This is Radio Beyond, coming to you from deep beyond at this very moment. So, I let my boat ride me a little bit, so that I could frame some of these thoughts and senses that I have, passions I hold dear, briefly enough. I like John Carpenter's perspective. He's roundly dismissed by academia. Like his colleague Dean Radin, who is aware of something very similar, right? That there's something going on way before consciousness that's transcendental to the models we're using to frame and think about and dissect and explain what's going on as a human being, experiencing mind states while awake. Mind states, it's bad language. Experiencing their peculiar transformations in the landscape of the mind. Experiencing the process of mind-like activity. These little flowers in the grass, how like stars upon the darkened sky. How like thoughts emerging from the depths, wherein they find their origin.